There's a big difference between having an iPhone and knowing how to use it. We're going to start, well, I'm sure you all remember where we stopped. But first of all, I'm going to tell you, I'm using a new translation of the Psalms. This was done by the abbot of Conception Abbey, and it was probably published about 3 years ago. But this is the translation they're going to incorporate into all new copies of the office the priest is using. And this has been put into the most recent in the Jerusalem series is the New Jerusalem Revised. And this is the book of Psalms there. This particular translation is made specifically for people to read in the office that's celebrated. So it's supposed to be more readable. We'll be the judges of that. So I'm going to start, we should start on verse 5, but what I'm going to do is read they're only a little bit beforehand, so I'll read the part beforehand. The author says, "In God alone is my soul at rest. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock, my salvation, my fortress. Never shall I falter. How long will you attack a single person to break that one down, as though he were a tottering wall or a tumbling fence?" Okay, so this is where we start. He says, their plan is only to bring down. They take pleasure in lies. With their mouths, they utter blessing, but in their hearts, they curse. And what he's talking about here is that people in dealing with certain people, or there's some people who deal with everyone else this way. I think there's a thing in psychology where some people try and build themselves up, both by the way they live and the way they speak. And other people accomplish the same thing by tearing other people down by the way they act and the way they speak. And what he's talking about is that these people who deal in this tearing people down, they ultimately rely on lies, okay? Oftentimes people who build themselves up rely on lies as well. But these people particularly rely on lies. One of the amazing things when you read the Bible sees the major division between people as being truthful or liars. And if you look at the way people talk and the way people think, we have this feeling that the world is divided into holy people and into sinners. But the fact of the matter is there's nobody who's not a sinner. So the world is divided into people who admit they're sinners and people who don't. And that's a line of truth. And I think it's really important in a person's life to make a powerful commitment to truth. It's not an easy thing to do, and there are lots of opportunities to violate it, and sometimes when we even feel forced to violate it. When I think of forced to violate it, I'm reminded of people during the Holocaust who were hiding Jews. They would never say they had them in the house. That would be idiocy. But this whole idea of, in the Bible, you cannot sin if you do not lie. A lie is the door to sin. And we've been through this before, but just to remind you, in the Bible, we have certain events. The first of any is a crucial event that tells you about everything that's happening. Like if you look at Abraham, you'll watch Abraham will travel exactly the whole distance the Jews will go in their history till they arrive in the Holy Land. And that all takes place in Abraham because he's the first one called. And scripture works that way with all kinds of things. Well, the first sin is the sin of Adam and Eve. And what happens is God says, you can't eat from this tree, you can eat from all the other trees. And Satan comes up and he says to Eve, I understand you cannot eat of any of these trees. And Eve corrects him immediately and says, no, we can eat of all the trees except the one in the center of the garden. We may not eat that fruit and we may not touch it. Eve has lied. God never said you can't touch it. He said you can't eat it. As soon as the lie is established, the sin will follow inevitably. And I just encourage you sometime, think back in your own life, how often you have sinned because you lied to yourself about a situation or lied to yourself about a weakness. But if you look around, every sin begins with a lie one way or another. So if we fight the battle on the ground of truth, then we keep one step removed from sin, okay? So they warn us about that. And the next thing is, with their mouths, they utter blessing, but in their hearts, they curse. And these people tend to be two-faced. After all, they're liars. So they tend to be two-faced and they pretend to be very supportive and all this sort of thing. I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, but occasionally I'll have someone come up to me and they're overly supportive, overly interested, and overly complimenting me. It always scares me to death. I don't know what's going on there, you know? And sometimes you find out they're just nice people, but not all the time. And it's something just to be aware of too, in the way, I think it's a curious thing when you really want to compliment people. We oftentimes end up moving into lies, okay? Even though we're trying to be nice, we are moving into lies. And the idea is to honestly compliment people. There's always something about people that can be complimented. He says, in God alone be at rest my soul, for my hope is from him. So the psalmist is saying that the psalmist does not rest their evaluation of themselves on what anyone else says, even if they're really complimentary. Don't rest your evaluation of yourself on that. And if they tear you down and everything, don't rest your evaluation of yourself on that. In fact, one of the key things that seems to be going through in the scriptures is you and I should not evaluate ourselves, period. You and I should try and do the best we can and all this, but ultimately judgment is in the hand of God. So just leave it there. Trust that God will judge benevolently, okay? Leave it simply in the hands of God. And other than that, try and live a life of holiness, a life in the presence of God, a life that grows, okay? It says, he alone is my rock, my salvation, my fortress, never shall I falter. And I'd like you to notice this idea of the rock and never faltering. This is the thing that Jesus picks up with Simon Peter. You are Peter, upon this rock I build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, okay? This idea of the rock foundation. We are on Psalm 62. In God is my salvation and glory, my rock of strength. In God is my refuge. This, the ending here, in God is my refuge, is where Terry, what's her name, dealt with the Nazis in Holland. She picked the title of her book from this verse about the God being refuge. And again, what he's saying is that God, of course, is salvation. But he says, I look to God as the glory. So how good I am is the judgment that comes from God. He puts the judgment on me. And he is my refuge. The interesting thing is that the judgment of God is not only a judgment, God is able to do something about it, you know? So that when I stand in the presence of God, the God who can see what's wrong in my life or the things that need to be changed or this sort of thing is the same God that can renovate my life and make me strong. And so God is refuge and salvation. We go into God, allow God to give the judgment. Trust him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts before him, for God is our refuge. Okay, notice the change. God is my refuge. Now he goes on to God is our refuge. And basically what he's talking about here is not only to trust to God, but this idea of pouring out your hearts before him. One of the things I've discovered, I have a set kind of prayer that I sort of worked into over a period of time, and I call it a dialogic prayer. And what I do is during the day, I try and speak to God in prayer, and I listen very carefully to what people say to me. I watch for the things I see. I listen for things I hear, all this sort of thing. And at night, I try and sort through that and see how God may have responded. Consider it a dialogue, that what you say to God somehow will be seen in a response. It takes a while to get into it, but it's a wonderful way to pray. And you can hear God's voice in, all this stuff put together. That is particularly good if you have poured out your heart before God. That, this is what's bothering me, this is what's really bad, this sort of thing. And I've oftentimes found in simple things that have been suggested to me by things that people say and stuff have actually resolved the problem that I set before God the early part of the day. But to be alert to it. And I don't know if this happens to many other priests, but as a priest, I end up giving people a lot of advice about running their lives. I know that terrifies you, but the fact of the matter is, I often, in listening to what I say to someone else, will resolve what was going on in me. It's an amazing thing. All of us are better counselors for someone else than we are for ourselves. We have a saying in theology, anyone without a counselor has a fool for a guide. And that's true, that we oftentimes learn a lot about ourselves and casually say things that would be very helpful to us if we're listening. It says, the children of people are only a breath, an illusion, the children of people. Placed in the scales, they rise, they all weigh less than a breath. And when I read this, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Book of the Dead in Egypt. Not that you may have read it or studied it, but it's painted on all the insides of the pyramids and stuff. So it's pretty hard to have seen anything about Egypt, not have some acquaintance with it. But I think you know that in the Book of the Dead, you come before the god Horus, and the god Horus weighs your heart against a feather. And if your heart is heavier than the feather, you're lost. And this whole idea to understand that people are just a breath, just a passing thing. I think it's, just to give you an example, one of my favorite people in history is Pope Pius XII. And Pope Pius XII did everything he could see in his power to protect the Jews. And shortly after Pius XII died, a play was written about him. It was written in Germany, and the play was called The Deputy. And it really destroyed his reputation, as though he didn't do enough for the Jews and all this stuff that went on and on and on. And I think 50 years after a pope dies, their papers become public. So as soon as the papers of Pius XII became public and people went through it, a book was written. If you want to read a really interesting mystery, if you like these, the title of the book is Church of Spies. And I think many of you have seen the movie Valkyrie, which was that plot to kill Hitler. When you read Book of Spies, you found out it was all engineered by Pius XII. He got in contact with the Catholic generals in Germany and set the whole thing up. But the book is heavily documented. But in dealing with history professors and stuff, the attitude to Pius XII changed overnight. just like that. And it's the thing, people gossip about you. All that can go in an instant. Do you know what doesn't go in an instant? Truth. Truth will stand. Truth ultimately wins. And so to be aware of this, that we want to rely on the truth, and anything else is just a breath. He says, do not put your trust in oppression, nor vain hopes on plunder. And this, he's speaking like in a war. At the end of the war, a country cannot survive simply on plunder. I think, Germany was doing a good job of that in the last war, in going through these countries. But even if they'd gotten the whole world at the end, then there's nowhere else to get the plunder. So it doesn't work. So he tells them, basically, do not rely on plunder. And the second thing is, never put your trust in oppression. We live in a world today where a number of countries have come out of oppression. And the countries that have come out of oppression are largely Eastern Europe. But many countries have come recently out of oppression. The thing that is strange to me is the countries that have not come out of oppression seem to be considering it now, seem to be considering governments that actually oppress the people. I'll tell you something that to me is, I heard it once many years ago, and I sort of keep it in my mind as a mantra. Teilhard de Chardin said this. Teilhard de Chardin said, if you look at history in 100-year blocks, every period there have been less slaves than the period before. Every period there's more governments elected by the people than before. And he goes through this whole thing. Every year, more people are cured by doctors. Every year, there's more, all these things. So humanity in these 100-year segments really, advances. The problem is you and I usually die before a 100-year segment is over, okay? So we just have to hold this in trust. It's all going to work out for you, but not for me, okay? So, but this idea that oppression, it cannot last and it cannot work, but it can be invoked and it can be there for a while, but oppression simply can't work. He says, even if riches increase, do not put your heart on them. And I think one of the things I love about this idea of the riches increasing, if you study church history, do you know that all the great saints of poverty came from wealthy families? And one nice thing about wealthy people, they at least know money can't make you happy. They have discovered that. I think it might. I'd like to try it, but they at least have learned that it is not going to do it, And so that's where they're saying. So he says, particularly if your money increases, don't put your trust in it. He says, God has said only one thing, and only one thing have I heard from him, that to God alone belongs power, and to you, Lord, merciful love. This, I'd like to point out for a moment, this idea of merciful love. Merciful love, they have a great difficulty translating this in the Bible. And the Bible is, the word in Hebrew is hesed, but you can translate it as mercy, or you can translate it as love. And I prefer to translate it as love, but he's translated here as merciful love. It is love, and it's love with all the, what do I want to call it? The passion and emotion of human love. He means, but the result of that passion and emotion of human love on the part of God is mercy. And that's where salvation comes from. Salvation comes from the fact that God has this tremendous love for us. I think one of the things to constantly remember about God when we look at our own lives. I can say this in all honesty personally. When I was being ordained a priest, we have what's called the Litany of the Saints, and you lay down flat and they go through. Well, I have a great knowledge of history. So every time they would name a saint, I knew who they were and I knew what they were famous for. So I was laying down there and I was thinking, one day I will preach like Augustine. One day I'll be as holy as John of the Cross. One day I'll be as poor as Francis. And my great fear is when I come to God for judgment, he'll say, I thought so too. But the interesting thing is that sometimes we forget that when God created you, he had options. God did not create the person he could not forgive into heaven. That person has never been created. And that's the meaning of that text. Many are called and few are chosen. The many that are called are what God considered. God could consider everything, And I speak personally, you may want to put together your own little thing for God, but I need to know why we have mosquitoes and not unicorns. But I'm willing to listen to an explanation, okay? But God specifically considered everything, and he considered options to you. And the reason he created you and not one of the options is he can forgive you into heaven, because the love that created you moves automatically to mercy. That's what this means. So we have this, and God only has that power. He says, and that you repay each person according to deeds. So we believe that God ultimately will repay each of us according to our deeds. Now, what does that mean? It's very interesting in the light of forgiveness and everything. It's important to know that we will be forgiven and towards heaven and all this sort of thing. But ultimately, we suffer the results of our sins. And I think you know that as the Jewish scriptures are written, you get the impression that if you do something wrong, then God punishes you. Now, the Christian scriptures don't carry that mode to them. The Christian scriptures see somehow the punishment for sin is in the sin itself. Like I would use the example, if a person gets drunk, it isn't God who sends the hangover, okay? It was in the bottle when you opened it. That's where the hangover was. But this idea that there is a punishment interwoven into sin, and the reason God tells us what he does not want us to do, the things he wants us to stay away from, is he knows the punishment woven into every sin, and he wants us to avoid that. But sins carry their own punishment, and ultimately we pay the price of every sin. And I've shared this with you many times, but one of the things we say in theology is God forgives and nature avenges. Nature has never learned how to forgive any sin, okay? If you think they have, you might consider the fires and the floods and the things going on right now. So now we go to Psalm 63. And the first verse of an awful lot of these Psalms was added later, so I'm skipping it, but it's a title. If you look in yours, it's probably even in different kind of print in most of the Bibles, but the title was added later. And the title here is a Psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judea. Okay, that was the book of Psalms existed was created over a long period of time. It's 5 books put together. And once the 5 books were all put together, a lot of these verses were added at the beginning of the Psalm to somehow place them somewhere in the life of David, okay? And even some of the batches in this book of Psalms are listed as being written by someone else. So, but when they were collected, they did this. So he says, "O God, you are my God. At dawn I seek you. For you, my soul is thirsting. For you, my flesh is pining, like a dry, weary land without water. And you remember, first of all, that this is appears in St. Augustine, God, you've made us for yourself, and we are restless till we rest in you. But this idea to ultimately understand that the place we belong is in a relationship to God. And in everything we seek in life, we are ultimately seeking in our hearts to find this place in relationship to God. Even a person who's an atheist, that is really what they're seeking. And the problem is that what we're seeking can be distorted in the way we're seeking it. So that we can look at the idea of, I'm thinking of, what do you call it? Al Capone. Al Capone actually believed, and he said this to people, that what he believed for the relationship to God was to build some magnificent monument to him. And so he spent his life acquiring the money for that monument. And I think I've told you about that monument. The monument is Mundelein Seminary. It's outside Chicago. He bought a valley, owns the mountains around it and the valley. There's a lake in the valley. The cardinal at the time was Cardinal George Mundelein, so he named it after him. The entire seminary and a football field so big they held the Eucharistic Congress there, all out of Carrara marble. And the architecture, Georgian architecture. But it's absolutely beautiful, unless you know how it was paid for. But it's an absolutely beautiful thing. But, you know, the idea, he was actually seeking this relationship with God, but totally messed up. You know, you cannot approach God by doing something God doesn't want you to do. It can't be done. And it's important to understand that what we're really seeking is this relationship with God. A huge amount of counseling for people in difficulties is pointing out how they can actually get to the goals they seek. Because we as human beings are endowed with pretty good things as to what we want. Security and peace and the love and a lot of things. We seem to mess up on the process of acquiring them. That seems to be where it's wrong. And like in the one of the aphorisms in Hinduism is nothing worth having can be pursued. So if you can pursue it, it's not worth having. And they talk about love. There's nothing you can do to make anyone love you. And the most important thing in human life is to be loved. But there's nothing you can do about that. You can love people, you can support people, you can enter into relationships with people, and more often than not, you end up loved. But you can't set about making someone love you. Just can't be done. So this idea of realizing that what we seek, oftentimes we mess up on how we go about it. He says, I have come before you in the sanctuary to behold your strength and your glory. This is one of the things you discover if you ever study Buddhism. In Buddhism, one of the important things is to find a way in your life to imbue yourself with the majesty of God. Now, the interesting thing is I think all of us, you know, go out sometimes and look at a beautiful night, or if you've ever been up in Canada when the aurora borealis is moving, even atheists talk about God when that's going on. But there are these moments, but the idea is we want to make that generally a part of our life. We want to seek the glory of God in whatever's around us. One of my favorite artists was Corita Kent, who was an Immaculate Heart nun who did a lot of, I think I told you she did silk screening. I don't know if you remember. She did silk screening and she would take advertisements and stuff. And what it really did was show you her prayer life. Like, for instance, she did a huge Wheaties box. And if you look carefully at it, it said Eucharist, Breakfast of Champions. But that's what she saw when she saw the box. You could see that she's in the grocery store and God's telling her about his power. My favorite was a Christmas card. She said one year on the front was a very traditional Madonna. And you opened it up and she'd taken the slogan from the Hallmark card company off the back and put it inside. And at that time, the slogan of the Hallmark company was, he cared enough to send his very best. But she endless, and what you do is you see someone who's found the majesty of God everywhere. One of the last things she did was a silk screen of a parking lot, must have been for a mall, but it was taken from such an angle you could see nothing but asphalt in every direction, okay? And right in the center, a dandelion was coming out of it. And she titled it Resurrection. And this whole idea, but you and I want to find a way that each day, somehow, we're touched by the majesty of God. Because it's in the majesty of God that we come to realize the stupidity of the things that go wrong in our lives and how insignificant our sins are, even in relationship to God. That's why God can forgive them. Think of the majesty of God, you know, that the Catholic Church condemned Martin Luther. I don't know if you know this, but Martin Luther maintained that when we fall into sin, we end up so corrupted. What God does is cover us over with Jesus. He covers us with Jesus. And that's, he takes that from the Pauline verse, put ye on Christ Jesus. So he says he sort of covers us over with Jesus. And in condemning Luther, the Catholic Church said, Luther taught that God was incapable of forgiving sin, so he covered us over. But the end result is you've given us more power to sin than he has power to forgive. And remember, that ain't true. No matter what anyone's sin is, no matter who you're dealing with, no matter what situation they're in, God not only is powerful enough to forgive it, it's what he does for a living. He forgives, okay? If he didn't forgive, I'll tell you quite honestly, and everyone in this room knows it, if he didn't forgive, none of us would be here right now. He's had ample opportunity and justice to get rid of every one of us at one time or another, and he didn't. And it's because of the love he has for us. He says, I have come before you in the sanctuary to behold your strength and glory. I will bless you all my life. Your loving mercy is better than life. My lips will speak your praise. I will bless you all my life. So in the presence of God, we make it a point to be involved in the blessing of God. And the blessing of God in in the Psalm thing is not seen so much in a prayer. Like I'll give you an example. We have a prayer in our liturgy that was written to imitate the Jewish Psalms, and that prayer is the Gloria when we say it on Sunday. It's written in the imitation of the way the Psalms think, but that's not the way we glorify God. We actually glorify God by the way we live. Okay. And I think, I don't know if this was ever a big part of American culture. I don't think I ever saw it in my own, but you know, it's something that you see a lot in the Philippines, that a person is supposed to live a certain kind of life for the honor of the family. And that's the only way you can prove you're a member of that family and deserve to be a member of the family, is to live in such a way that you're an honor to the family. And that's kind of what it says. I'm in God's family. And everything I do, good or bad, reflects on God as well as God's people. Look how the church has suffered over the pedophilia thing. Everything one of us does reflects on God, reflects on his family. And so we are called to glorify God, but by the way we live. I will bless you all my life. In your name, I will lift up my hands. And in your name, I will lift up my hands has two meanings. The first thing is, to lift your hands to pray, because he's talking about praising. But the second thing is that to do something in God's name is to do it in God's way. And think of how much, like human beings, basically, we operate through our hands. So I should lift my hands to what honors God. And an example is you see someone falling, you help them, or they need help carrying their groceries. You've lifted your hand to God when you do that. That's lifting your hand to God. Everything we do for one another and for following God's law is actually lifting our hand to God, not just the prayers thing. My soul shall be filled as with a banquet. With joyful lips, my mouth shall praise you. And this filled as with a banquet, it's kind of a funny thing, because we as Americans, I think back on the meals that I eat, we always banquet. Banquets, we generally eat. What we want, as much as we want, and when we want. We generally banquet, much to the horror of our doctors. But the idea is that in the world in which this was written, they usually knew only one banquet. And the one banquet they knew was wedding banquets. They would save up and prepare, and then when someone got married, then they threw a banquet. But these people were not used to banquets at all. And so this idea that when they actually had them, they remembered them and honored them with great thing. And so God says that my heart shall be filled as with a banquet completely, and with joyful praise, my mouth shall praise you. When I remember you upon my bed, I muse on you through the watches of the night. And this musing, this is the idea of thinking of God and in the evening when you're, and I found this by accident. I had something awful happen at one time in the seminary, and I found out that I sleep like no one in the world. I sleep very, very well, unless there's something I'm worried about. And then I grind all night, But if I can't sleep and haven't got anything to grind, it doesn't matter. I just lay there and rest. It's no problem. If I got something to grind, I literally grind that all night. And so I started, when I would have situations like that, to try and think of things dealing with God, the creation of sunsets, that sort of stuff, and try to do that. It really helped. Nights were divided into watches. The Roman watch changed every 3 hours. And so they counted their nights in that way. He says, for you have been my strength. In the shadow of your wings, I rejoice. And this idea of strength and rejoicing are tied to the idea of raising a baby bird, that when a baby bird is in the nest, the baby bird is safe in the nest. And while it's in the nest, the parents feed it and take care of it and everything. And that's where you become strong. And under God, that goes on our whole lives. In the Jewish tradition, God fed the Jews in two ways. He fed them first by manna and second by his word. In the Christian tradition, he feeds us in two ways, by the Eucharist and by his word. And so this is how we're fed by God, and this is why we rejoice. He says, my soul clings fast to you, for your right hand upholds me. And the support that we receive from God causes us constantly to look to God and to rely on that support. It's always there, but over a period of time, we get used to it. And over a period of time, we learn to trust in it. It makes us confident. I remember I've shared this with you before, but as a little child, my father was a professional boxer before he got married, and so quite an athlete. But giving up boxing was a condition of the marriage. It had one great benefit for the kids, though. If a boxer lays a hand on anyone, it's a lethal weapon. So we were never punished by my father, okay? So I only wish my mother had gone into wrestling or something. But anyway, the idea is that in San Diego, where I live, Pacific Beach, is the first beach where surfing came to the mainland from Hawaii. And it's because of the size of the waves. And so I would go out there with my dad. As we were going out, every single wave would be over my head. And then you'll go down. And I was never worried because I was holding my dad's hand. He had a game he played that would put him in jail today, that he used to go out on the concrete driveway. And my sister and I would jump into his arms from the roof of the garage, and he would catch us. Both of us lived through it. And fortunately, neither house on either side was occupied by a lawyer. But anyway, the thing was the absolute confidence, you know. If my father told me to jump off the roof into his arms, I did. I knew he'd catch me. If he was walking into the ocean, even though I was underwater, I did. I could trust him. God wants us to reach that point of trust with him. And most of us, I think, you need to keep in your mind what you have survived, okay? Anyone of any age has survived several things. You need to remind yourself of that so that you can stand in confidence before God and ultimately taste the pure survival when you enter heaven itself. Okay, we'll stop there now and pick it up tomorrow. Thank you very much.